today we are building and painting one of the coolest looking legions, the World Eaters. The World Eaters, known for their brutal melee, red armor, and generally not being very nice, while also having an interesting background while dabbling in the one-dimensional storytelling, they are one of the aspects that really make Warhammer 40,000 what it is today. And after scaring myself with flying sprues, it's time to finally build our angry red boy. And while building this berserker, I realised that there's pretty much no battle damage on any of his armour. And this model is going to be for an up-and-coming diorama, and I cannot imagine a World Eater without some form of damage on his armour. And after making some dents in the armour, I wanted to have some bullet holes to make it look like he's running towards his enemy. So with my drill, I scuffed up all of his armour and made a few holes. So with a really sharp hobby knife, I made chips all over his armour by using a V-shape, cutting it into the edges of his armour panels, like his knees, shoulders, and his head crest. And for his base, I pressed record after I finished, but I used Smart Mode 2.0 as it's my usual basing technique, but I did it in the same way as my Black Templar Inquisitor. I then grabbed some sand and some foam flocking and sprinkled it all over that clay. And then once it's settled in, I grab some isopropyl alcohol and then some white glue on top so it dilutes nicely into the base. Now I did use a bit too much IPA here, as you can see it's running all off the base, so maybe a little bit less here. So let's quickly go outside and prime this bad boy in black primer, as it's finally time to start painting him in some corn red. Now we can finally get some colour onto this mini, and I chose corn red for our base coat today as it's a really nice desaturated red. Now it looks quite bright now, but once it's dry you'll see what I mean. Now when I base coated this mini I used 2 thin coats, waiting for it to dry first before applying the second. And once you're happy with the base coat, it's time to move on to our second red of the day, Vermilion by Vallejo. Now with this I mixed it 1-to-1 with the corn red as a nice mid-tone for this model. And when it comes to highlighting this red, I started with the tops of the armor panels and slightly drew in a sketch-like pattern in straight lines going down. Now I didn't want to cover the whole of the armor panels, I wanted to cover about 2/3 going downwards, and because it's a thin paint, you'll see some of the dark red behind it. As you can kind of see here, I'm using more of a stippling technique, bouncing my brush on and off, making sure that my highlights aren't clean and kind of a bit messy. And as I stipple it, you'll see more and more texture build up on the model. Because this isn't the World Eater's first battle, I want that grimness, I want that texture all over the armour. And at this point I have switched to 100% of that Vermilion red, as I really want to start boosting these highlights of that deep red. And when it comes to the placement of when I'm painting, I just really want to add these tiny dots towards the top and the centre of all of the armour panels. And this was about 2 to 3 layers of paint, just generally building up the red with tiny dots, making this nice cool gradient. And once that red was finally done, it's time to move on to painting all of that Forsaken trim. And for this I used decayed metal, probably now my favourite metallic paint ever, taking place over black metal, and I painted this over all of the armour trim. And this is probably the worst part about collecting a Chaos Force, as this is where all the mistakes will happen in your paint job. Just make sure and try your hardest not to get any of this metallic paint onto that red. And with that, let's move on to painting all of the silver metallics, and in this case I'm using Thrash Metal by Scale 75. And adding all of this warm silver over the model really helps make this model start to pop. It's around this time where I'm starting to think this model doesn't look terrible, it's now in the okay stage of painting. And thankfully, not like the trim, this won't take too long, as all the silver pipes won't take too long to paint. There's just one really important thing, just like the brass, don't get any on that red. And oh wait, I just did that. And this is how you can fix that really quickly. Okay, now this is a code red, so you're going to have to quickly grab a clean paintbrush and dip it into some of your water. Now repeatedly flush that water all over that paint, and hopefully it will still be wet enough that you can remove it. After a few times where it looks like there's no paint, grab some tissue and quickly dab away the excess water, and hopefully you fixed your mistake. And thankfully, I was lucky this time. And before applying any more contrast paints to the model, I want to add some pre-highlights. For this I chose quite a light grey and almost white, and almost like a comic book, just quickly sketched some fake highlights onto the model. And I also painted the skulls with the same colour, as we were going to be using a wash for this as well. And the contrast paint I chose to paint his gloves in was Black Legion, as it's a really good black contrast paint and it gets the job done pretty much instantly, and with those pre-highlights, it adds a nice subtle tone beneath the black. And then quickly moving on, for all of the leather on the model, I used Cygor Brown, which is such a beautiful brown contrast paint, and it's definitely up there with some of the most necessary contrast paints I could put on a list. And for all the skulls, I used my skeleton paint mixture of a 3-to-1 mixture of Narnal to Skeleton Horde contrast paint. It really is one of my favourite mixtures I've ever come up with. And with the skeleton skulls done, it's time to move on to a shading phase. And for this, I'm using a black enamel wash from AK Interactive. It's definitely one of my favourite enamel washes, and the reason why I'm even using an enamel wash in this is just to add some of that battle damage and to fill in those gaps. And one of the questions I get asked loads of times is if I varnish my miniatures beforehand. 9 out of 10 times I don't. Now this can be quite controversial when it comes to using enamel washes, but I simply have never really ran into any of the issues when it comes to removing paint from the model when you're stripping it. The worst case I've ever found is maybe 1 or 2 edges on the miniature around the shoulders, have a tiny bit of paint missing, but I can easily whack that back on, and it saves me so much more time than varnishing it. But if you're wondering, that's why I don't. I'm just a bit lazy. And I got a bit too carried away with myself there as I forgot to paint his arm. So a quick few shades, and it's good enough for me. I waxed a couple more enamel washes on it, just to make it look more in theme with the rest of the paint scheme. So after our enamel wash, it's time to add some more highlights to the model, as the black wash has done what I wanted it to do and dulled down some of the metals and a tiny bit of the red. So using a mixture of silver and decayed metal, I ever so slightly added some edge highlights to all of the metallics, just so it shines nicely when you're holding the model. And I did the exact same thing to all of the red using that vermilion red, especially around his face just to make it pop a bit, but I also added a bit on his shoulders and his pauldrons, anywhere where I felt like a deeper red would look nice. And to quickly finish his base, I grabbed some very light grey and basically a white, and dry brush the top of his base, before we get our Mantis Warriors green contrast paint out and paint the whole base in it, and it adds this lovely grass-like colour. Then next, I grabbed some of the previous brown we used and dabbed it in just areas to add a nice dirty tone to the mixture to make it look a bit more natural. And then with a very light green, I added nice little dots where leaves would be, and that leads us to the end. And there he is, our wonderfully, beautifully brutal World Eater. Painted in what I like to think is a pretty easy scheme, and it was pretty quick to paint as well. If you learnt anything or enjoyed the video, make sure to like and sub, and next time we'll be turning these miniatures into a diorama, so make sure to tune in next time. See ya!